Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth of 5 webinars we have for you this week as part of our September webinar series. Today I'm joined by Hybe Schouts, who will be talking to you today about practical test strategy using heuristics. If you have any questions for Hybe, please type them into your questions field there on your control panel. And then at the very end of the webinar, we will go through your questions one by one. And don't forget, you can type your questions at any point during the course of this webinar. So now let me hand you over to today's presenter, Hybe. Hello, Hybe.
Good morning. Can I start yet?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, okay, then show my screen. And here we go. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. And I want to talk about test strategy today, especially and specifically using guide word heuristics. So making this presentation, I was inspired and helped by a couple of people here on this slide, and many of the material I use is from rapid software testing. So so far the acknowledgements. So let's get started. So what's test strategy anyway? And when I talk to people about test strategy, I'm most likely to ask these questions like, what's test strategy to you? Why do you make one? And what does it look like? And before thinking about those things, I always like to find definitions, and I found this definition by ISTQB, but that isn't very helpful to me because it's a high-level description of test levels to be performed and testing within those levels for an organization. To me, that's not practical enough. That's not specific enough. So I was thinking more like this. To me, test strategy is a solution to a very complex problem. If we look at testing, one of the most important missions for testing is to collect information about the system to help managers, product owners, or other people to make decisions. So how do we uncover the most important information about the system, and how do we do that efficiently and effectively? And of course, there are a lot of constraints and a lot of resources I want to use. And of course, it's all about risks. I think this is pretty complex stuff. So how do you do that? How do you create a model for your testing? And to me, I like to approach this as problem solving. So I'm thinking about missions or problems like what kind of information, where are the biggest risks, what does our product owner wants to know, and while doing that, I try to define solutions for them. And of course, I need to communicate it in some way. And because we're handling a very complex problem and a lot of information, I'm thinking about ways of capturing it as well. And of course, I want to do actual testing. So how is my test strategy going to help me do my testing? Again, a test strategy to me is a solution for a complex problem. How do we meet the information needs of our stakeholders, and how do we do that in a very efficient way? So let's zoom in on test strategy for a moment. I hear a lot of people speak about master test plans and test plans, and well, what are we talking about? Well, to me, a test plan is a set of ideas that guide my test project, and part of that is strategy and part of that is logistics. And the logistics are, how do I use my resources? It's interesting, but I think we should focus more on the strategy, the set of ideas that guide our testing or our test design. So I rather, if I document my plan, I rather take out the strategy and make it a separate, I don't know, document or model. So let's have a look. Normally, I see a lot of people say, okay, it's test strategy, or the strategy is made by test managers, and we create some sort of model there. Sometimes I see people struggle with that, using huge documents to document that. And then we go over to another phase, and we call that the testing or the test execution. And then, oh, I see there's a typo in my slide here. And the last part is, of course, reporting, not test execution. But these are not separate phases. To me, it's all testing. So what I like to do is build it up from small to big. I like to start small. I like to learn about the product first. I like to think about risks. I like to think about what is this product I'm testing, and what's interesting about it. And over time you learn more about the product. So my test strategy is, well, pretty small in the beginning, and I start testing and I start exploring and I start discovering more information over time, and then my test strategy grows. So I never create one huge model up front, like some people try to do in master test plans, but I start small. And how do I do that? Well, there are a lot of things to consider, and Richard Edgren did an excellent workshop on test strategy at Nordic Testing Days a couple of years ago, and I borrowed this slide from him. So think about what's important, not only about risks, but also about value. What makes this product we're testing valuable for our customers, for our stakeholders? What are the goals? What are our missions? What do we want to achieve? Which techniques do you want to use? Do you have test ideas? What information sources? How do we recognize problems? That's what I call an oracle. An oracle helps me to see if something is a problem or not. Obviously, we need a lot of models. Models to help us fight complexity. What do our customers find important, like quality objectives or quality criteria? Who are your testers? How do they think? What are their skills? So there's a lot of stuff to think about. And I use guide word heuristics to help me. I don't have one test strategy. This is a model of an agile project with maybe do releases after 3 sprints. So in iteration 0, I think about an overall test strategy. I think it's wise to think like, well, maybe we're going to do some performance testing or stress testing later on, so you might want to prepare early in your project. But we also want to think about, how are we going to test this iteration? All these user stories, how do they mix together? So you might want to think about that as well. Or maybe a test strategy for a story. A set of ideas that guide my testing while testing this story. Or a release strategy. Or maybe a regression strategy or an automation strategy. So to me, test strategy is more than just one document. To me, it's a model. It's a way of thinking how I want to approach my testing. So it's not one document. It's probably a set of documents. And I'm really happy that I learned about the heuristic test strategy model, because it helped me think, it helped me fight complexity, and it gives me a lot of guide words that help me think about the stuff that's important. So we have the project, our context. Who is in my project? Who are my stakeholders? What do they want to know from me? What kind of tools do I have? Stuff like that. We have the quality criteria. What's important about this product? Is functionality important? Obviously, in most of the times. But what about security, usability, performance, stuff like that? And we have the product itself. And I like to zoom in on the product. Even though I might have a list of requirements and specifications, I still want to create my own model of the product. It helps me zoom in on the product. It helps me look at the product. It helps me modeling the product. And if you combine these things, of course, obviously in the middle there's the testing. So there can be risk anywhere. So we have to think about risk in the product, in the, using a list of quality criteria, and of course also the environment, the project environment can have a couple of risks, like if I want to do performance testing and I don't have a specialized performance tester in there, well then that might be a risk as well. And the context, the way we work, is handled with procedures. The quality criteria are closely related to the oracles. How do I recognize problems? And obviously the product we want to cover. So how do you cover it? Using product elements. I will zoom into that a little bit later. At last, all these things end up in doing tests, doing experiments, and we have to report about it. And in the middle, there are the skills we use, the guideword heuristics we use. We always have to consider cost versus value. Is there, how much does it cost to test something, and how much does it give me? And there's diversification. Diversification in people, diversification in test approaches. The more test approaches or techniques we use, the more types of bugs we find, because every single test technique or approach looks for different information, uncovers different bugs. So this is the heuristic test strategy model with all the guideword heuristics, and we're going to zoom into them later. But all these guide words help me think, help me deal with the very complex environment we have, the complexity in the system, and helps me think about the right things. So if I think about context, I think about mission. I think, what is my mission? What do I try to achieve with my testing? What information are my stakeholders looking for? Information helped me think about what do I know already? What information is available to me? Developer relations help me think about the relations I have in my team, but also in the organization or in the projects. The test team zooms in on who's doing the testing, what are the skills, what can we learn from each other, stuff like that. Equipments and tools help me think about what environments do I have, what tools do I schedule, of course, how much I have, and when do people need it, what are we going to deliver on the project environments. Then we have on the left side in the and we use these guide words. Again, there are probably a lot of different lists of it and on what's important for my stakeholders. Obviously capability, functionality, stuff like that, but what about reliability or usability or charisma of the product you're using? Is it cool to use? Does it look good? Security, scalability, stuff like that. Risks, if you think about risk analysis, these lists can be really helpful to make sure that you don't oversee certain criteria of the product. And obviously you want to give some insight in coverage. What, how thoroughly do I examine the product? And in rapid software testing we use this definition. X coverage is how thoroughly you've examined the product with respect to some model of X. So if you think about code coverage, it's code coverage is how thoroughly you've examined the product with respect to some model of the code. Or risk coverage is how thoroughly you've examined the product with respect to some model of risks. So you need to create models in order to, well, give yourself and the people you work for insight in coverage. So how do you give insight in product coverage? Well, basically by creating a model of the product, and we'll zoom into that later. I like to talk about risks a lot. So if I do a risk analysis, the second step I want to do is talk about risk coverage. How thoroughly have I examined the risks and requirements? Well, basically that's pretty easy to do if you have good requirements documents, and if you don't, you have to create some sort of model to give people insight in how thoroughly you have examined the requirements. So how do you model a product? I like to use San Francisco Depot to help me zoom in on a product. What's its structure? What is it made of? What are the functions in the product? What data does it use? What kind of interfaces are there? Obviously, there's a GUI most of the times, but are they APIs or database interfaces? What are the platforms? What does the product depend upon? Like operating systems, or maybe mobile, or is there a middleware layer in where your front end runs upon? Things to consider. And operations, how is the product used? So there are functions which state what the product can do, and operations help me think about how is the product used, what kind of different users do we have, how do they use the product, why do they use the product, and time. Time was added last in this heuristic list, and I think it's important because time has a great influence on software, like how the dates obviously and time as data in your product, but also what happens if we use the product over time, how does synchronization work, many things to cover. And I like to create mind maps for my San Francisco Depot model, which help me to, well, closely look at the product. And the reason I do this is that because if you can't see it, if you don't know that something's there, how are you going to test it? So my San Francisco Depot model helps me closely look at the product. What's there and how can we use it and how can we test it? That's the second step. And in the middle there's the testing. And I like to diversify my testing. So I need a list of stuff I can do, different approaches, different techniques I can use. And for that we have this interesting list of heuristics, pronounced as futskura. Well, think of it as a call out that Roman soldiers do when they ran into battle. So how do I test functions, domain testing, stress testing, all kinds of different approaches and techniques you can use to think how to test my product. And with diversify I mean, and this is a picture taken from a presentation from James Barker long ago, that visualizes the different ways of looking at a product. Like smoke testing, you use a little bit of data and a little bit of functions just to check the main functionality. But if you do function testing, you probably go way deeper. You're going to test an extensive set of functions, probably not going very deep in data, but zooming in on all those functions. And if you do reliability, you want to use all kinds of data to make sure that your most important functions keep working whatever data you use. And risk testing is like using your experience to to see. I've seen some problems in the past. Do they occur here as well? Or maybe, well, from the risk analysis, we've seen a couple of risks all over the application, how I'm going to approach these. So there are many guideword heuristics that help me think about the environment, the product itself, what's important, so quality criteria, and obviously how I'm going to test them, so test techniques. So how do these things fit together? Well, if you think as a product, as a cube, first thing you do is think about the environment. Think about what's important. What do I have? What do I need? What do my stakeholders need? And then attack or have a look at the product from different sides using product elements, test techniques, and quality criteria. So looking from all these different angles helps me think of a balanced test strategy. And one of the things, especially in Agile, where we want to do testing as fast as possible, but of course in any project you want to do this as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So testers need to start, ask for testability and use it in your test strategy as well. If you have a scriptable interface, you can control your product way better. So it's easier to test. If you use log files, you're gaining observability. So it's easier to look behind the GUI and look inside the product. The more the product is available and the simpler it is, the easier it is to test. If it's not stable, you're going to run into a lot of issues while testing. So you might want to have a stable product. So make sure that your team does unit and integration testing before you start attacking the product. The more information you have, the easier it is to test. So start asking questions. Start asking for visual models like architectural overviews or flowcharts, how your users work. This all helps you attack this complex system you're testing and learn about this product easier. Because again, testing is way easier and far more rapid when your product is testable. So let's zoom in and wrap all the things up I said earlier. A test strategy is guides your testing. So it's not, to me, it's not a document. It's a model. It's a concept. And every situation requires its own unique test strategy. And even if you don't have it documented, you have it in your head as a mental model. So to me, making it visual, making it, creating all these models for, like the San Francisco Depot model where I model my product, it helps me attack this complexity. And it needs to be specific. I see a lot of people create lists of like, okay, we're going to test functionality with 3 stars and we're going to test performance with 2 stars, and these stars tell me the relative effort we're going to put in. But it's not really helping me. Maybe in an early stage it might help me, but while testing, while talking about test strategy, I need more specifics. Of course, it needs to be practical. We need to, well, have a test strategy that's executable, that's usable, that's explainable to the people who are involved. It needs to be justified. So if I know my customer's mission, if I know my product owner's missions, his need for information, if I know how are they going to determine if we can go live with this product, or if it's good enough, or it meets their desires. So all those questions need to be answered. Again, it needs to be diverse. And that's on the bottom slide of the part of this slide. It's better to use diverse half measures, as we call them. I rather have you do 10 different approaches a little bit than one imperfection, because every single approach, every single technique finds different information, finds different bugs. It needs to be resource efficient, so make use of all the available resources you have. Start using nifty tools. Have a diverse team that can easily look into different aspects. I think it needs to be reviewable as well, so that people can understand what you're saying. And I'm going to show you my map later that that a colleague of mine used. And can you explain it? Can they see what you mean? Anchored, changeable, and of course it needs to be, well, as correct as possible, not too vague, not too long to write. So there are many aspects, and creating a good test strategy is difficult. So practice it. Use retrospectives to talk about, okay, what did we miss in this strategy? How can we make it more efficient? How can we make it easier to understand? Stuff like that. Talk about it. Let other people help you. And make it visible. I like to use mind maps, as I said before, and this is a mind map made by Ruud Cox for a medical product. And he used the San Francisco depot model to model his product, and also he added some numbers to it as a form of priorities. And this is not very detailed, but if you click on the little yellow documents in there, there's going to be more detail. Again, to me, a test strategy is not one document, it's probably a couple. One is my product model, as you can see here. Another one might be a risk list, and another document I use might be those risks against the measures I take. So I have a document with a table in it like risk is performance, and we're going to do performance testing using this and this and this technique or method. So several documents add up to my test strategy. Another way of making it visible and making it easy explainable is just draw your architecture on a whiteboard and start putting stickies on it. Every yellow rectangle here is a sticky with a session or an approach or a small amount of testing. So you can easily see where do we do which type of testing. And you can also use an agile dashboard like this, where you just put your testing on stickies, and well, in this picture you're looking at, every sticky is a session, and a session is a small amount of testing, like for an hour, maybe hour and a half. So you can exactly see what part of the testing is done and what part is still in progress. Again, putting all these things together, think about all these things, help you deal with your complex product. So start using guide heuristics, because a heuristic is a followable method to solve a problem, and a guide heuristic or triggers me to think about the right things. All these checklists I show you, all these lists of heuristics help me come up with a good solution for a problem. So basically that's what I wanted to talk about, and I hope that in this half hour I just gave you an overview on what's test strategy. It's not one document, it's a model, and it can be in your head, and most of the time for me it's a couple of deliverables like a mind map, a risk list, maybe a list of or a table of risks versus the work I want to do to mitigate that risk, and I use guide heuristics to help me think. Basically, that's it.
Thank you very much, Hybe, for your presentation. We're just going to go through one or two other slides here before we look at your Q&A session. I'm just going to open my screen here. And if you'd like to hear more from Hybe, he will be presenting at the EuroSTAR conference this year. He has a tutorial on Tuesday entitled How to Be an Explorer of Software. And maybe, Hybe, you might like to give people a little insight into what they can expect from this tutorial.
Sure. Well, I was inspired by a book by a Canadian conceptual artist called Carrie Smith, and she helps children to look at software, or well, look at the world better. She wrote a book, How to Be an Explorer of the World, and using her book I translated into how you can explore software. So if you want to become better, train your skills in observation, modeling, pattern recognition, stuff like that, a better explorer of software, join me in Sweden in November.
And also, we have our early bird deadline coming up this time next week, next Friday. So if you'd like to come along and perhaps attend Hybe's tutorial, now is the best time to book your ticket. Right now you'll be able to avail of a 10% discount. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the different ticket options, head over to the EuroSTAR website there, and you'll find all the information you need. We also have a group booking discount, and this is available all year round, not just on the early bird. And what this means is if you buy 4 tickets, you'll get a 5th ticket absolutely free. So that's 5 tickets for the price of 4. And if you're not too busy, why not come along to join our 5th and last webinar of this webinar series this afternoon with Penny Resnick, and he is going to be talking about testing cloud native applications. So now let's have a look at some of the questions that have come through here for you, Hybe. And I'll just open my little questions panel here. The first question asks, do you think test strategy should be developed for a particular testing assignment or for the whole company or organization?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think there are a lot of different levels in strategy. So I think a company might have a testing policy or a testing strategy for the whole company, but since I think a test strategy should be specific for one product or even one part of the product, if you think about test strategy for your whole organization, it's obviously going to be, well, high level and in pretty general, like all we like to think of tooling you're going to use, or maybe how do you train your testers? What do they need? So yes, there should be. I think you should think about it, but if I think about test strategy, I like to define it as a set of ideas that guide my test design or testing. It's specific for a product, specific for a part of a product that I'm actually going to test. So I hear a lot of companies talk about their test strategy for the whole organization. I think I rather call that test policy. And when I talk about test strategy, I talk about something that helps me test a specific product.
The next question for you, Hype, asks, what do you think is the difference between test approach and test strategy?
Well, again, test strategy to me is a set of ideas that guide my testing, and in that I use techniques and approaches. So basically, an approach can be a function testing, but it's also a technique. So it's again, a test strategy for me is the set of ideas that guide my testing, so that contains approaches and techniques and stuff in there. And an approach is how you do something. Where in the test strategy, I also like to think about why do I do it. Obviously, how am I going to do it? So they're closely related, but I think test strategy contains approaches.
There's someone else here asking, can you elaborate more on oracles?
Of course. Oracles are ways to identify problems. And there are many different oracles. And in testing, we use a lot of them. The most common, of course, are the specs or the requirements. If the spec says 2 and 2 is 4, then if you see in your software 2 and 2 is 5, that's obviously a problem using that oracle. So that's one. But also comparable products can be an oracle. If you're testing Word or PowerPoint, but you're a Mac user, then Page and Keynote are comparable products. They have the same purpose, but they do things differently. So if you see something in that product that it's different, then there might be a problem. Or if you look at font types in Word and WordPad on Windows machines, if you see differences in there, it might be a problem. And again, oracles are also heuristic, so they don't give a defined answer. You can't say this is wrong, but you suspect it might be wrong, and they help you see problems. Or another way of seeing problems are, well, how the world works, or laws, or all kinds of user desires, like I cannot work with this very well. So you're using yourself, your own desires, as an oracle. So oracles are a way to identify problems.
Are there any specific suggestions for agile projects with respect to test strategy?
Ooh, that's a very broad question. Let me elaborate a little bit more on how I would think about this strategy in agile. And basically it's the same in any kind of project, but agile has some certain ceremonies that I can easily identify and talk about a little bit more. The strategy starts with thinking about what's the product, what are the risks, and if you're working in an agile project, I would advise you to start thinking about testing the very minute you start thinking about how are we going to build the product. So in refinement sessions, you can talk about test strategy. How are we going to approach testing? What are our test ideas? What risks do we see? If you're there with your team, you can ask for testability. Hey, wouldn't it be great if you can build me a tool that can create some data for me so I can do faster testing? So that's in refinement sessions where you talk about test strategy. If you have a dedicated tester in your team, well, maybe he or she thinks about testing a little bit more and create mind maps for the rest of the team. But if you don't, I would make somebody well responsible to make sure that the whole team thinks about all the aspects they really want to focus on. So the strategy it's a team thing. So basically you do it in refinement, and of course in your sprints you think about your test strategy per story, and it starts in your refinement session thinking about it, and well, you develop your test strategy while testing the product itself. And here you also want to get developers involved, because part of your test strategy obviously is also unit testing and component testing. So you don't want to do things, you don't want to test the same thing twice in most of the times. So what are my developers testing, and how am I, again, if you have a dedicated tester, how am I going to approach my testing? So, and in the end, it all needs to fit together. So you might even want to consider, how are my users going to test? Are they only going to click around in the product in the demo, or are we going to do that? So that's stuff you can talk about while doing a planning session and creating all these tasks for each user story on the board. So you don't have, I don't think you have dedicated moments where you well, create a test strategy. It's continuous critical thinking you do, but there are ceremonies where you obviously can get together with the team and talk about it.
And what's the difference, Hyde, between a test strategy and test plan?
I showed a slide where that a difference is stated. To me, a plan is a plan of approach, is a set of agreements. It's strategy and logistics. So logistics is, which environment are we going to use, how many people do we have, how much time do we have, what documentation is available, all things you have to do, like in a plan of approach, assumptions, all these things that help me do my project or my task. And the test strategy helps me think about the testing. So it's a set of ideas that guide my testing. So it zooms in on what are we going to test, how are we going to test it. So a plan is a plan of approach, strategy plus heuristics. Strategy zooms in on the testing itself. How is it done?
The next question here asks, how important do you think it is that the whole team is aware and knows the contents of a test strategy? Or is it important only for testers and the ones involved in testing?
No. I think the whole team needs to create the strategy as a team. Testing is not something that is the responsibility of testers only. It's a team responsibility, because the strategy. Let me take one step back. Software development to me is research and development. So you do something, you do an experiment, you find something out, and based on the information you have, you do your next experiment. So software development is finding out how can we create this product for our user, and normally we start small and we start building upon what we already have. So testing gives me the information about the real status of the product. So this information is also for the developers. They want fast feedback. Is it still working if we look at regression? Are we doing the right things? Are we building it right? So this information is really important for developers as well. And they do testing themselves all the time. Maybe they're not aware of it, but if they type a line of code well, they go back and have a look at it, and well, they try running it. So they're doing little bursts of testing all the time, and I want to know what they're doing and why. Not in detail, they don't have to write it down, but we need to talk about it. Like, okay, we have this new date function in our software somewhere. Did you check all the dates, or did you just check several? So I can help you think about how you could test it. So I think test strategy is for the whole team. There's most of the time one or two people responsible for keeping track of the whole model and keeping the overview, but creating it, thinking about it, and executing it, I think it's a team responsibility.
And when do we finish or complete a test strategy? When can we get the final strategy document?
That's interesting because, again, to me, test strategy is not a document. It's a concept. It's a model. And I think my test strategy is final the second I end my testing. Because in my last action or last test I run, I might do something new. I might find something that's, hey, that's interesting. If I see this, I want to try this and this as well. So it's look at it as a war. If armies go into war, they create plans and strategies how to deal with the enemy, but they only find out if it's working, and they only find out the real situation while there. So they keep adjusting their strategy, and that's, I think, one of the most difficult things to do is think about strategy as a model and documenting it on the right level. So I don't want to document every single detail because that will take me a lot of time. So you have to think about how am I going to document my model, my thinking, and how is this documentation gonna help me think about the testing I want to do in a more efficient way. Again, test strategy is not a document, although parts of it will be documented in mind maps or in tables or in risk lists or in product coverage outlines or all kinds of artifacts that help me create insight and overview and help me do the right testing. So my test strategy is finished the second I end my testing and I end reporting, because while reporting on paper, but also just talking to people about my testing will probably give me new insights like, hey, wow, now I look at it from a distance, that's interesting. We've done this, this, and this, and maybe we need to focus a little bit more on this if we have some time left. So it ends basically at the very end of my of the work I do.
Someone else here is asking, what is the benefit of using this test strategy model?
That's a good question. The first time I looked at it, it was like, okay, it's obvious. It's something about context. I look at that. We use quality criteria as well. The San Francisco Depot model. That's a lot of work. It seemed to me. So why am I using this heuristic test strategy model? And when I started creating mind maps, and I started out with San Francisco Depot product elements mind maps, I found out that it helps me zoom in on a product. As I said during the presentation, if you don't see it, it's easy to forget that it's there, so you won't test it or you won't even look at it. So that's the first thing I realized while using this model is this is a interesting list of guide words heuristics. It's a sort of checklist that helped me think, what is a product made of? If I look at product elements, or which quality criteria are there? Or if I look at my context, what is important to think of? So this model helps me focus on the right things. And this is the model James Bach made, and Michael Bolton helped him develop it later. It's their model. So if you think of products and, I don't know, maybe calculation boxes in insurance companies are important and we really want to focus on those, just add it to the model. Make it your own. Maybe there are things that you think are less important. Well, just change the model. Again, this model helps me as a list, as a set of checklists, trigger word heuristics that help me think fast of the things that are important to me and I need to think of. And sometimes I just step over one or two, like, okay, it's not important now, it's not important now. But I thought of those. So it helped me think faster. That's basically why I use this model.
Another question here, or a comment so much, says, how can I design my test strategy when I don't have much time for testing but need to test big applications?
I think that's a problem in itself. If you don't have much time to do testing and it's a complex product, but especially in such situations, I advise people to create a test strategy, because if you have a limited amount of time, you really have to focus on the most important parts. So where are the risks? Create a risk list. Use the quality criteria to think about risks. What is this product made of? As I said, San Francisco Depot the first time will probably take you an hour or maybe two to create, but the more you practice it, the faster it will go. And it helps me focus on the right things, on the most important parts. So creating all these mind maps and lists for me helped me do my work way faster. And again, because I use different artifacts in my test strategy, it's not a book I'm writing. I don't go into detail. It's my documentation. So it's only I and maybe my teammates are going to use it. So I don't need to be self-explaining. We have the skills, we have agreements on what do we write down and how do we write it down. That is part of our culture, part of our way of working, and we don't write a book that everybody can read. It's our documentation. So creating overviews helps us focus on the right things. We can create them pretty easy and pretty fast, and it will help us do better, more focused testing.
The next question here, Hyde, is quite long, so if you need me to repeat it, I will. And this person here mentions, I also like using mind maps and heuristics to guide my test ideas. One problem I often face is, how do I document all these different tests? Putting them all into test cases doesn't work for me, only in certain situations. Test sessions are fine for other aspects, but again, not all situations. Do you have any ideas how to approach this?
I think this is a very common problem. And I think this goes back to the last question. What do you document? And I consider cost versus value here as well. If you have a high overview mind map like the one I showed you earlier, that gives overview on which specific parts of the product you want to test or which specific quality criteria is important. And then if you do the testing in sessions or in threads or using scenarios, it can be anything. I make notes while I'm testing, and if I don't have enough time to really document what I've done, I just stick with my notes, update my mind map a little bit more, and well, basically, if somebody comes to me and said, hey, can you explain your testing? I can. I use the mind map for the overview. I use my notes to show what I done in detail. If I have a little bit more time, I might make session sheets, which are more official documentation on the sessions and the actual testing I did. If we want to automate parts of my testing, I create some test cases out of it, but basically I do that mostly afterwards, because then I exactly know how the product works, and then I exactly know how I want my testing. So which steps need to be done, and maybe even which data I'm going to use. So this is an interesting problem that I don't have a general answer for, because it highly depends on well, if you're testing a medical product, there are probably going to be compliance demands on what you write down, and if you just test I don't know, an app or a game, there will be less compliance demands on what you write down. So it highly depends on what you like, what your teammates or your stakeholders want. The first rule of documentation is, if you want to document something, think about it. How is it going to help you? What's the value of creating documentation? One thing that I use a lot in my testing is I debrief myself with others. So we talk about my testing and other testing just face to face. So I try to transfer my information to my teammates, like, hey, I did a 2-hour session on this and this is what I tested, this is what I found out, these approaches that I use, and then they're gonna ask me questions about it, like, hey, did you test this, and what do you think about that? So we debrief each other, and that's also a way of transferring the information. And we use the testing story, as we call it, in there, which is basically what's the status of the product, what do we know about the product, how did we test it, and how happy are we with our testing, so how good was our testing. Talking about it, documenting parts of it, making good notes helps me create less formal documentation and do my testing faster.
Another question here asks, how is the test strategy communicated and to whom?
Good question. Well, to everybody who really want to learn about how do I do my testing, so obviously to the team, how do I communicate it? Well, by talking about it. I don't write books. I hate extensive documentation because it takes a lot of time to create. It takes a lot of time to maintain. So I mostly stick to lists, maybe a PowerPoint presentation, schematics, mind maps. That's basically what I do. And how do I communicate it? By giving them the schematics or the mind maps or the visuals, and just talk them through them. Just talk them through it. Like, hey, this is my mind map, this is my coverage outline, have a look at it, do you have any questions? This and this and this is what you see there, this is about the product, this is how I tested it. So to who? Well, my team, but also I think it's very important to talk about your testing to the product owner. He's in charge, he's the one who decides what the team needs to do, not how they do it, but what they do. And he's the one who's going to accept, in the end, the product. So I think he needs to be aware of what we do. And my ideal product owner helps me develop my test strategy. I can ask him questions like, hey, I have a week of testing ahead of me. What's the first thing? What concerns you the most? What value do you want to get out of my testing? So he's not going to tell me how I'm doing my testing, but he's going to tell me what information he wants. So he's part of the team as well. And the third audience for my test strategy might be the rest of the organization, but they are not really interested in much detail, so management or other teams, I sometimes just go there, make a couple of PowerPoint slides, show a couple of mind maps and say, hey, this is how we approach testing in our team. Well, what do you think? Or how does this help, I don't know, in the chain? So if you know my testing, then you can see what we done and you can focus on the things we haven't done yet, stuff like that.
Okay, and I see you've had like 30 minutes or so of Q&A there, Hive, so you must be wrecked from it. But we might just do one more question to wrap it up because we've gone a little over time here. And
Okay.
this person here is asking, what should we include in mind maps? And I was just going to say as well, if you wanted, I can hand you back control of the screen if you wanted to go to your mind map slide, if that helps at all.
No, I can. I think. No, I can. I think I can explain. Well, what do you put in your mind maps? That's basically the same question as how much do I document, how much detail. It highly depends on what you're doing. If you're creating a product coverage outline for a primary banking system, and you try to do that in one mind map, I think it's not going to work because it's too big, it's too complex. But you can make several levels of mind maps, like an overview, and then on the, I don't know, accounting part, you make another mind map. And if you're testing specifics of accounting, you might want to create a mind map for that as well. So you have several layers, several levels of detail in your mind maps. And the golden rule for me for a mind map is just put in there as much detail as you would like, but don't use it as a Word document. If you're going to put a lot of text in there, just start using other tools like Word. But if you're using a lot of words, you might see that as a trigger heuristic for, hey, am I documenting too much? Am I going too much in detail here? So there's no one answer to that question, how much do you put in your mind maps, as long as it serves a purpose. Again, first rule of documentation is think about the value, think about the need for that documentation. If you're going to make extensive documentation, it's expensive to make, but it's also expensive to maintain. So I put, again, there's a function in there that allows you to add notes. You can put a lot of detail in there. That's fine because it's practically a little bit hidden. But watch out putting too much information in there and find out what works for you. What works for me doesn't work for you probably, and the other way around. So find your own way and see what serves you. Just practice and experiment with it.
Okay, let's wrap it up at that. Thank you very much again, Hive, for taking the time out and talking to us today about test strategy. There's been lots of really great feedback and lots of questions, and we've all really enjoyed it. So that's it from us here today. We have another webinar this afternoon with Penny Resnick, and you can register for that over on Test Huddle. And a lot of you are asking, is this webinar being recorded? And the answer is yes, we record all of our webinars, and that too will be available over on Test Huddle. So thank you all and take care.